This video is going to cover time-dependent analysis, and it's geared towards epidemiologists. If you're a biostatistician, you might find it kind of overly simplistic in the way that I'm explaining it, but hopefully it'll help you look at the variables in your own research and figure out how they should be modeled most appropriately. So the scenarios I'm going to cover, each of them have a time-dependent exposure. That's your exposure of interest. And it's what's happening to the confounder that makes them different and vary in complexity. So the most simple is a fixed confounder, not varying over time. And the other two are time-dependent confounder scenarios, so the confounder and the exposure vary over time. And the two I'm going to look at is whether the confounder is exogenous or endogenous, and I'll get to what that means in a second. So a lot of variables are time-dependent, whether we model them that way or not. An example here is smoking, where an individual didn't just smoke from birth to death. There were periods, assuming follow-up is over their lifetime, there were periods where they were exposure negative and positive, and there's lots of ways you can represent this. The simplest is just binary. At baseline, they are smoker or non-smoker. A little more valid is ordinal, so you might have something along the lines of never smoking, past smoking, current smoking. And even more valid is a cumulative dose, where you figure out how many packs they smoke per week, how long they've been a smoker, and you have some continuous measure of dose. Standard regression is suitable for all of these, but the most valid way to handle this type of data would be to treat smoking as a time-dependent variable. So what this looks like is basically breaking up the individual's follow-up time into when they were exposure negative, positive, and so on. And there's different ways that this needs to be handled, and like I mentioned at the beginning, that depends on what's happening with the confounders. So basically, time-dependent Cox regression is what we're going to talk about for situations with fixed confounders or exogenous time-dependent confounders. And marginal structural modeling, I'll mention briefly, as a way to deal with endogenous time-dependent confounders. So this first and most simple scenario is we have this time-dependent exposure, smoking, and we have these two time periods. We have time 1, which is summer, and time 2, that is winter. They have a smoking status at either time. They could have gone negative to positive, positive to positive, and so on. And first thing you want to notice is that we have our most proximate smoking status that is obviously related to our outcome, which I'm representing as lung cancer here. And we have our previous smoking status. It's pretty intuitive that whether you smoked in the past, that's going to be related to whether you smoke in the future. People tend to do what they've been doing. And another thing you want to notice here is that smoking at time 1 has an independent relationship to the outcome. What that's basically acknowledging is that they were eligible to develop the outcome in the summer, basically. They didn't need to go through both these time periods to develop lung cancer. And the fixed confounder we're going to look at is sex assigned at birth. That has a relationship with the outcome. If you're an actual researcher in this area, you might disagree. I'm just using it as an example of a fixed confounder. And it's also related to smoking status at each of these time periods. So this is what it would look like in the format of a directed acyclic graph, where time-dependent variables are usually represented as smoking, in this case smoking time 1 and smoking time 2. And sex here does not have a time 1 or time 2, it's just this constant fixed confounder. So the analysis that would be suitable for this would be a time-dependent Cox regression. And just an overview of what that looks like. Like we mentioned at the beginning, you'd have some function of time that you're using, this might be years or days. But basically you have a time 1, 2, and 3, and this is continuous generally. And yeah, you break down the person's data into the time periods where they were a non-smoker and the time periods that they were a smoker. And the way this actually looks in a spreadsheet, you would have basically each of these separate time periods where the exposure changes would be represented as a row of data. So this first period is represented in this first line. And basically for each of these time periods, you define time 0 as when it began and time 1 is when it ended. So for this first time period, it went from T1 to T2.5. That's what we're showing here. Smoking was negative. Sex is always 1 here. We're not considering it time varying, so in every row it's 1 for this individual at least. So this line of data tells us this person was a non-smoker. It started at time 1 and went to time 2.5, and there was no event. This next period, it went right from time 2.5 to time 4.5. Again, no event, and here smoking was positive. And in this final time period, they were smoking negative, went from time 4.5 to 5, and they had the event. That's basically what the data would look like here when you're feeding it into the time-dependent Cox regression. And you would end up with a hazard ratio for each of these time periods that is a function of basically the effect of smoking at that time relative to someone who was a non-smoker all the way through. And like you would have separate hazard ratios for these time periods. I couldn't find much on it, but I believe you can get a overall treatment effect or an overall hazard ratio that is some type of weighted average of the hazard ratios over all of the time periods. But if you're interested in how the hazard ratio varies over time, which is kind of by definition a violation of the constant proportional hazard assumption, it's the idea that the effect of smoking varies by time, and you can analyze this and by looking at these different hazard ratios. But typically you're interested in kind of an overall effect, which my understanding is that it's a weighted average. The next most complex situation is a time-dependent exposure with a time-dependent covariate. So again, looking at time 1 and time 2, the new confounder I'm looking at here, we're still looking at smoking in the 2 time periods, but I'm looking at factory work here. So this could be a stretch, but the situation I'm assuming here is that basically working at a factory could lead you to smoke, in the sense that if there's a culture at this factory that during breaks there's a social smoking culture where they go out around back and have a smoke together, that could be a situation where even if you didn't smoke when you arrived, you might get caught up in that smoking culture and become a smoker. Something to note here is that although factory here is a confounder, it's going to the outcome, it's going to smoking, it doesn't go to smoking during time period 1. The idea here is that a cause needs to come before an effect, and this is like an instantaneous moment where something in this time period can't cause something else here because, again, a cause needs to come before an effect. So factory here is an exogenous time-dependent covariate, and what that basically means is it can cause smoking at various time points, but smoking cannot cause factory work at a different time point. There's the scenario I'm going to get to later on is one where that could be true, but when we're assuming that this is not true, like when we're assuming that smoking cannot cause factory work, factory is considered an exogenous time-dependent covariate, and that makes the situation a lot simpler. Whenever you can justify this to be true, it's going to make things way easier, basically. But you need to be able to strongly justify that what an individual does cannot cause this confounder. It's this like broader thing, such as like weather or something out of control of the individual. The individual can't influence it, or at least this variable cannot influence it. Is the way I should probably say it. So time-dependent confounding is not present here because it's depending on the time. It's a confounder or a mediator. It's never both, and I'll get to a situation where that's true, or when it is both. And time-dependent Cox regression is still applicable here, which makes it a lot easier. So I've modified this follow-up data. Still, green is non-smoking and purple is smoking. So they had a period of non-smoking and another period of smoking. And now we have this other variable, factory work, where blue is when they weren't working at a factory, orange is when they were. Um, so yeah, this person's smoking status and factory work status is varying over time. What we can do here is before it was simple, we just separated the data into when smoking changed. But now we separate the data into periods of constancy across all time-dependent variables. So we have a period here where they consistently were a non-smoker, a non-factory worker. They started working at a factory, even though their smoking status held true. This changed, and now this is a new period of time-dependent analysis. And again, their factory work continued through, but their smoking status changed, so we would separate it, and finally it remained constant here in smoking non-factory work until the event. Now we would separate the follow-up data, again, one row per time period where the covariates are constant. So I'm not going to belabor it too much because we already went through it in the other one, but just going over the first couple. For time period 1, it goes from time 1 to time 1.9. I guess it's just before 2 here. And this person was a non-smoker, non-factory worker. And then time 2 here, it goes from 1.9 to about 2.8. They're still not a smoker, but their factory work is now positive. And that's basically how you would represent that in a table. And again, you have a hazard ratio during each of these time points. And yeah, you can look at them separately if you are interested in how the hazard ratio changes over time. Or you can, like I said before, have some overall effect of smoking controlling for factory work, and that would be some type of weighted average. The most complex situation here, and it looks very complex, is it's not necessarily because there's 3 time points. What makes this complex, I needed 3 time points to demonstrate it, is why there's 3 now. But what makes it different is smoking is now causing factory work. This is, again, a stretch, but the way I could maybe explain this is, like we already talked about, this factory maybe, I guess I didn't mention, but this factory is causing lung cancer maybe because they are working with some carcinogenic substance, that are fumes or whatever. But yeah, back to the smoking. We might say that factory can cause smoking, like I said, because of the social culture of smoking during breaks. But your smoking status at time 2, that could feasibly be related to whether you continue to work at the factory. One way that might happen is if the smoking culture is leading to a rich social life, you might keep this job because you're enjoying the smoking culture. Conversely, you might not be a smoker and you might feel isolated. You might not continue to work there. Or even if you took up smoking at time 2 and you want to stop smoking, you might realize working at this factory is not good for you. So smoking at time 2 might lead you to not work at the factory at time 3. This is considered, factory here is now considered an endogenous covariate, where it causes the exposure at later times, but is also a cause of the exposure at earlier times, creating feedback and making for a very complex situation. And on top of that, now our effect of smoking is very convoluted. It's not just smoking 1 to smoking 2 and the independent effect of smoking 1. You now have this like network of causation where everything downstream is part of the causal effect. And we're interested in this overall effect of smoking across time periods usually. Just breaking down, this is an explanation of how each of these versions of factory is influencing the results. So factory 1 here is just a simple confounder. It is causally related or at least associated with smoking at time 2 and has an independent relationship with the outcome. So it's just a simple confounder. Skipping to factory 3 because factory 2 is the one I'm going to talk about most. Factory 3 is simply just a mediator of smoking at time 2. We want this whole effect of smoking, everything on the causal path, and it is a mediator of that effect, but it is itself not a confounder. It isn't it isn't pointing at any of the versions of smoking here. So factory at time 3 is just a mediator. Factory at time 2 is complicated because it is a confounder of smoking at time 3. It goes right to it and has an independent effect. But it is a mediator of smoking at time 1. Smoking at time 1 has this causal effect that goes through factory 2. So this creates a problem where if we control for factory at time 2, we're not getting the total effect of smoking. If you've taken any regression classes, that's like a common thing you always hear. You don't control for intervening variables or mediators because they're entangled with the effect we're looking at. You'll attenuate it if you control for that and make smoking look less harmful. So yeah, if we control for factory at time 2, we eliminate some of this effect of smoking. But if we don't control for factory at time 2, it still is exerting a confounding influence on smoking at time 3. So basically, you're in trouble if you control for it or if you don't control for it. So standard regression approaches just won't typically work. The simplest option for handling this, we're going to get to the marginal structural modeling, but the simplest one is to simply focus on smoking at time 3, acknowledging this complexity over here. But if we ignore the combined effect of smoking and just look at like the incident exposure, the most recent exposure, that simplifies things because now we just have prior smoking as a confounder. It goes to smoking at time 2, it goes to smoking at time 3, and as independently related to the outcome. So now it's just a confounder, and factory at time 2 also is directly related to smoking and the outcome. So now we just control for past smoking and past factory work, and you're good. You basically have controlled for confounding. So you can use standard regression here, but it's also a very simplistic view of how smoking varied, and basically you're kind of it's not doing the trick, but it's eliminating a good chunk of bias by doing it this way. But you're not looking at the question you sought out to answer, basically, which is this combined effect of smoking across the time periods. The last thing I want to note is just that you got to control for past outcome status. That's kind of goes without saying, just because that's how you design a cohort study. You take these outcome negative individuals and follow them forward. But there's a situation I haven't really outlined here where the exposure can cause the outcome and the outcome can cause the exposure. If there's this bidirectional, like, reverse causality situation or feedback, you would have to include past outcome in this model and control for it, basically. Oh, and just a final thing I want to note is that if factory can affect smoking at the next time period and at an even later time period, it becomes pretty complex, and what we were talking about before, it might not apply. It becomes more complex all of a sudden. So the preferred the preferred modeling approach to model basically this time-dependent exposure and endogenous time-dependent confounder is to use marginal structural modeling. And I have it just here with like little magic symbols. I'm going to get into the nuts and bolts briefly, but it's kind of hand-wavy and magic where it creates this hypothetical population where exposure is independent of confounders. So we have this like overall smoking effect we're looking at that we've artificially made it unrelated to factory. The nuts and bolts of how that actually happens, it's more complex than this, like I mentioned at the beginning, but inverse probability of treatment weighting is the nuts and bolts behind the magic. So you would figure out the probability of smoking modeled in terms of your confounders and figure out a propensity score model that is modeling the probability of smoking. You run that on every one of your participants to figure out their probability of smoking at a given time point, and you weight the individuals by this probability. So you're dividing its inverse probability of treatment, so you're dividing by their probability of treatment. And this effectively creates a pseudo population where those with a high weight, so like a low probability of the treatment they received, are kind of like, for lack of a better word, cloned. So like they would show up as multiple individuals in the data set almost. It's not that simple, but you're effectively weighting the population across these confounders and making it so you don't even need to control for them. You've effectively controlled for them through this process of creating a pseudo population. And there's other options besides marginal structural modeling. That's kind of the big one now. But the other ones that we're like, I'm not going to talk about, but just briefly mention, are structural mean modeling or nested modeling and G formula approaches.